What happens when a powerful millionaire finds an abandoned child on a cold, dark night? Gabriel Thornton, a man who's built an empire, is about to face a life-changing decision. But when the child's past unravels, Gabriel must confront not only his own demons, but a dangerous enemy from his past. Can he protect the innocent, or will the truth destroy everything he's fought for? This is not just about survival. It's about redemption. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any updates. Gabriel Kingston stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring out at the sprawling city of Chicago below. The lights blinked in rhythm, casting shadows across the glass as if the city itself was trying to break through his icy exterior. At 32, Gabriel had achieved what many could only dream of: a thriving tech company, millions in the bank, a sleek modern home. To the outside world, he was the picture of success. Yet, standing there in his impeccably tailored suit, he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that gnawed at him. Success had always been the goal, but now it felt like a cage. There was no joy in it, no real satisfaction, just an endless pursuit of something he couldn't name. His fingers brushed against the cold glass, and his thoughts drifted back to a time when ambition had come with a price. Gabriel's gaze fell on a photo frame on his desk, a picture of a younger man and his business partner, Dominic Wells. Their smiles were genuine, full of promise, but Gabriel had long since removed Dominic from his life. He had been ruthless, severing ties in the name of ambition. "You'll regret this," Dominic had said, his voice laced with betrayal, the words now haunting him in the quiet moments. Gabriel swallowed hard, pushing the memory aside. Regret, he told himself, was a luxury he couldn't afford. His phone buzzed, snapping him back to reality. It was a reminder from his assistant about a meeting with the board of directors, a meeting that would seal the fate of yet another ambitious deal. He didn't need to look at the message to know that it would be another hour of discussion about profits, growth, and new acquisitions. Empty discussions. There was always another meeting, another project to finish, another milestone to reach. But as his fingers hovered over the phone, he couldn't help but wonder, what was the point of it all? The success, the wealth, the power, it was all meaningless without someone to share it with. Gabriel turned away from the window and walked toward his desk. His eyes scanned the room, fancy wood paneling, leather furniture, all of it a reminder of the man he'd become. He had always known that wealth was the key to everything, but now it felt like a hollow victory. He moved toward the bar, pouring himself a drink. As the amber liquid splashed into the crystal tumbler, he let the cool silence of the room settle around him. The weight of his choices pressed heavily against his chest. 1,000 decisions, some small, others large, had led him here. A lifetime of business deals and calculated risks, each one driving him further away from the very thing he had once thought mattered most: connection. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his assistant about a disturbance near one of his properties. It wasn't urgent, but there was something in the way it was worded that pulled at something inside him. Gabriel paused, the glass halfway to his lips. For a brief moment, an unusual restlessness stirred within him, a desire to do something, anything, that wasn't tied to spreadsheets and conference calls. He sighed, setting the glass down. The door of the penthouse opened, and his assistant stepped in, ready to discuss the meeting. Gabriel knew what was expected of him. He would give his answers, make the decisions, and move on, just as he had done countless times before. But tonight, something felt different. Something was calling him out there, beyond the polished world he had built. As the assistant continued speaking, Gabriel's thoughts wandered, but only for a moment. He straightened up, shaking off the feeling, and nodded in agreement. The business world awaited as it always did. The elevator doors opened, and Gabriel stepped out into the lobby of his building, still feeling the uneasy weight of the moment that had pulled him from his office. The message had been vague: a disturbance near one of his properties downtown, a place he hadn't visited in months. His assistant had been quick to dismiss it, assuming it was just another minor issue that could be dealt with through phone calls and paperwork. Yet, something about the message tugged at him, an instinct that had long since been buried beneath layers of business decisions and corporate affairs. As Gabriel rode in the back of the sleek black car, the city passed by in a blur. The bright lights, the towering skyscrapers, the glimmer of success all felt so far away in this part of town. The streets grew darker, the buildings older, and the air felt heavier. It was a side of Chicago he rarely saw, a side that seemed to hum with its own brand of survival. This wasn't the world Gabriel was accustomed to, the world of high-end restaurants and exclusive clubs. This was a different world altogether, one where power and wealth didn't hold the same sway. The car slowed as they neared the address from the message. Gabriel leaned forward, squinting through the rain-splattered window. In the dim light, he saw something that made his stomach tighten. There, on the corner of the street, standing under the flickering glow of a street lamp, was a small figure, a child. The child was barely visible through the fog and mist, huddled in a tattered blanket and cradling a small bundle in their arms. The baby seemed barely more than a few months old, wrapped in a thin piece of cloth. Gabriel's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to call the authorities, but something stopped him. The child's face, fragile, weary, filled with a depth of sorrow far beyond their years, struck a chord deep inside him. His thoughts flashed back to his own childhood, a time when he had felt equally abandoned, though for different reasons. It was an instinct that Gabriel had long suppressed, that fleeting desire to care, to protect. He hadn't felt that in a long time, not since. The car came to a halt in front of the child. Gabriel stepped out quickly, the cold air biting at his face. The child barely looked up as he approached, still clutching the baby. Gabriel hesitated, not wanting to appear threatening. He crouched down to their level, speaking gently. "Hey," Gabriel said softly. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The child didn't answer at first, only staring up at him with wide, suspicious eyes. The baby stirred slightly in the child's arms, but neither of them moved. Gabriel swallowed. "My name is Gabriel. What's yours?" After a long pause, the child whispered, "Marcus." Gabriel nodded, trying to keep his voice calm, not wanting to frighten the boy further. "Marcus, where are your parents? Do you need help?" The boy's eyes flickered toward Gabriel, uncertainty and fear crossing his face. "I'm not going to leave him," Marcus whispered hoarsely, his grip tightening on the baby. Gabriel's heart clenched. The desperation in the child's voice was like a punch to the gut. He knelt down further, his voice soft and reassuring. "I won't separate you. I promise. I just want to help." There was a moment of hesitation, a long silence that stretched between them. The boy looked from Gabriel to the baby, as if weighing the options in his young mind. Finally, he nodded, though the mistrust never fully left his gaze. Gabriel stood and helped him into the back of the car, wrapping his coat around Marcus and the baby to shield them from the cold. As the car pulled away, Gabriel sat in the back, trying to process what had just happened. The weight of the situation pressed against him. He had taken the children, two abandoned souls, into his care without fully understanding why. What had brought him here to this point? He had long since lost his belief in compassion, drowning it out with deals and negotiations. Now, he found himself carrying the responsibility of these children, as if some long dormant part of him had woken up. The city's skyline loomed in the distance as they drove back to the penthouse, the lights glimmering like false promises. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the small figure of Marcus, curled protectively around Noah, the baby's head resting against Marcus's chest. Gabriel felt a strange pull in his chest, an unfamiliar ache that threatened to overwhelm him. He had always prided himself on being in control, on keeping his emotions at bay. But this was something different. He didn't know what had just happened or what he was walking into, but he knew this much. His life, which had been so carefully curated, was about to change forever. When they arrived at the penthouse, Gabriel led them inside. The warmth of the space felt foreign to Marcus, who clung to the baby as if it were the only thing he could rely on. Gabriel watched as his housekeeper, Eleanor, fussed over the children, but he noticed something in Marcus's eyes, something that reminded him of his own childhood fears. As the night grew darker, Gabriel retreated to his office, standing by the window once again, staring out at the city below. His thoughts churned. He had offered them shelter, but at what cost? He didn't know why, but the children, especially Marcus, seemed to have a hold on him, drawing him in, pulling him back from the emotional abyss he had spent years crafting. Was it guilt? Was it just instinct? Whatever it was, Gabriel knew one thing. This wasn't going to be easy. And yet, as he glanced at the sleeping children in the next room, he felt a strange sense of purpose. He had made a choice, and there was no turning back now. Gabriel sat in his study, eyes drifting over the documents on his desk, though his mind wasn't on the deals or numbers. He couldn't stop thinking about the children, about Marcus, the young boy who had somehow infiltrated his carefully curated world, stirring feelings he had long suppressed. He had been expecting a night of silence, just like any other, but instead, he had found himself facing something entirely new, a responsibility he didn't understand, and a bond he wasn't prepared for. The sound of a door creaking interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Eleanor, his housekeeper, standing in the doorway, a concerned look on her face. "Mr. Kingston," she said softly, "the boy is asking for you." Gabriel's chest tightened at the mention of Marcus. Asking for him? He hadn't expected this so soon. The child had only just arrived, yet it felt like an eternity had passed since he first saw the fear in Marcus's eyes. Gabriel set the papers aside and stood up, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over him since the children's arrival. As he walked toward the guest room, his thoughts raced. What was it that made Marcus so distrusting? The boy had been through something. He could see that. But what? What had driven him to that street corner in the first place, holding his baby brother in his arms as though the world had already abandoned them? When Gabriel entered the room, he found Marcus sitting on the edge of the bed, Noah still asleep in his arms. The child's gaze flickered to Gabriel, wary but not hostile, as if unsure whether to see him as a protector or another threat in a long line of disappointments. "Hey, Marcus," Gabriel began softly, taking a cautious step forward. "I'm glad you're awake. Can I sit down for a moment?" Marcus nodded hesitantly, his eyes never leaving Gabriel's. The boy looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. Gabriel sat down on the chair beside the bed, careful not to get too close, respecting the invisible barrier Marcus had erected around himself. "I don't want to be a stranger to you," Gabriel said, choosing his words carefully. "But I want to help. I know you're scared, but I'm not here to hurt you. You and Noah are safe here. You don't have to worry." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his brother, who had begun to stir in his arms. He shifted slightly, adjusting Noah's blanket with a tenderness that only a sibling could understand. Gabriel felt something tighten in his chest, an empathy he hadn't expected. It was as though Marcus's protective instinct had already claimed Gabriel's world as part of his own, and yet the walls around the child's heart were still so strong. "You can stay here for as long as you need," Gabriel continued, his voice calm, but there was a hint of uncertainty. He was offering protection, but how could he expect a child to trust him when the world had already let him down so many times? Marcus finally spoke, his voice small but full of guarded strength. "You won't take him away?" The question hit Gabriel like a physical blow. He understood the fear in Marcus's eyes now, the terror of being separated from the only family he had left. Gabriel paused, his own heart thundering in his chest. He couldn't imagine the trauma that had led Marcus to this point, and it became painfully clear to him that his role here wasn't just to provide shelter. It was to earn their trust, to be the one person who wouldn't break his promise. "No," Gabriel said firmly. "I won't take him away, I swear. You and Noah are safe here with me. Nothing will separate you." For the first time, Marcus's expression softened, just slightly, but it was enough. His eyes, still wary, seemed to relax a fraction. Gabriel saw the flicker of hope beneath the layers of fear, and it was then that he realized something. This wasn't just about offering them a roof. It was about showing them, over time, that they were worthy of safety and love. But Marcus wasn't ready to completely let down his guard. He didn't speak for a long time after that, his gaze distant, lost in thoughts that Gabriel couldn't begin to understand. Still, Gabriel remained in the room, quietly observing, silently offering whatever comfort he could without pushing too hard. The night stretched on, the silence between them both heavy with unspoken words. After what felt like hours, Gabriel stood up to leave, but just before he reached the door, Marcus's voice stopped him. "You promise?" Marcus asked, his eyes searching Gabriel's. Gabriel turned back, his heart hammering in his chest. "I promise," he replied, more certain of his words than he had been in years. As Gabriel left the room, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. He had made a promise to a child who had already seen the worst of the world. But could he keep it? Could he truly protect these two children, keep them safe from whatever darkness was lurking in the corners of their past? The answer wasn't clear yet, but Gabriel knew one thing for certain. His life had already begun to change. His emotional walls, the ones he had spent years building, were cracking, and the desire to protect Marcus and Noah was growing stronger by the hour. The next morning, Gabriel was already at his desk, a fresh wave of determination coursing through him. He would figure this out somehow. Marcus and Noah needed him, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond business deals and boardrooms. As he looked out the window, the city below seemed far less imposing. There was a new weight in his chest, a weight that felt heavier than any deal or acquisition he had ever made. But it was a weight he would bear, because for the first time in his life, he was invested in something that mattered more than money or power, and he would fight to protect it. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Gabriel's penthouse, casting a soft glow across the room. The house was silent, save for the soft rustle of papers on his desk. Gabriel sat in his chair, his gaze fixed on the files in front of him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The events of the previous night had left him with more questions than answers. He had promised Marcus that nothing would separate him from Noah, but the fear in the boy's eyes lingered in Gabriel's mind. The children's arrival had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about offering shelter. It was about uncovering the mystery of their past, understanding what had led them to the cold streets of Chicago. Marcus's cryptic words echoed in his ears. "You won't take him away." What had happened to these children, and what were they running from? Determined to find answers, Gabriel knew it was time to dig deeper. He couldn't afford to sit idly by and wait for the answers to come to him. The stakes were too high, and the longer he waited, the more dangerous the situation could become. After a tense breakfast with the children, Gabriel made his decision. He couldn't let Marcus and Noah's past remain a mystery any longer. He reached out to his most trusted contacts, requesting information on a man he hadn't thought about in years, John Wells. John Wells had once been a business partner, a man who had helped build Gabriel's empire in its early days. But when their partnership crumbled, Gabriel had severed ties with him, and with that severing, John had vanished. Or so Gabriel thought. As the hours passed, Gabriel's anxiety grew. He was no stranger to the world of corporate deals, but this felt different. There was something far more dangerous at play, something far darker than he could have anticipated. The more he uncovered, the more Gabriel realized that John Wells's disappearance might not have been voluntary. He had been involved in criminal activity, and the clues led back to one unsettling conclusion. The children were connected to him. Gabriel's phone buzzed. A message from his contact. It contained an address, a rundown warehouse in a part of the city Gabriel had never ventured into. The message was clear. "This is where it started. Find out what happened to them." His heart raced as he grabbed his coat. The time for sitting back and waiting had passed. It was time to confront the past, both his and Marcus and Noah's. The car ride to the warehouse was a blur. Gabriel could feel the tension building with every passing mile. The city's landscape seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, the closer he got to the address. The gleaming skyline of Chicago, which had once seemed like a symbol of Gabriel's success, now felt like a distant dream. It was replaced by the gritty streets of the lower city, the kind of place he had avoided for years. When the car finally stopped, Gabriel's pulse quickened. He stepped out and looked at the building in front of him. The warehouse was old, its metal exterior rusted and worn from years of neglect. A place forgotten by time, just like the man he had once trusted. Gabriel hesitated for a moment, but only for a moment. He knew that if he was ever going to find the answers he sought, it had to be here. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the faint hum of old machinery. Gabriel walked cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The warehouse was eerily quiet, abandoned, yet it felt like someone, was watching him. As he moved deeper into the building, Gabriel's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of life. And then, in the far corner of the warehouse, he saw it. A small table stacked with old files and photographs, some of which were marked with red X's. Gabriel approached carefully, his eyes flicking over the papers. The photos were of Marcus and Noah, images from years ago, some taken when they were much younger. Their mother, Lena, appeared in several of the pictures, always in the background, her face obscured. But Gabriel could tell from the weariness in her eyes that she had been hiding from something, from someone. And there, at the center of the photos, was John Wells. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. The man he had once called a partner had been in the shadows of their lives all along, lurking behind the veil of their pain. Gabriel's fingers trembled as he reached for one of the files. It was dated 2 years ago, just before Marcus and Noah had appeared on the streets. Inside, the pages were filled with cryptic notes about John Wells's dealings, illegal contracts, debts, and, most disturbingly, references to a criminal syndicate that was involved in child trafficking. Gabriel's heart sank. This was worse than he had ever imagined. The files told a horrifying story. John Wells had been involved in much darker activities than Gabriel had ever suspected. And the children, Marcus and Noah, were his victims. They had been caught in the crossfire of a life they never chose, a life marked by violence, fear, and manipulation. As Gabriel read the final pages, one line stood out. Wells's children are to be kept at all costs. They know too much. They are the key to securing Wells's legacy. Gabriel's mind raced. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Wells's legacy wasn't just money, it was the children. Marcus and Noah had been used as pawns in a game that went far beyond Gabriel's understanding. But one thing was clear. John Wells was willing to destroy everything to protect his secret, and Gabriel had just uncovered the truth. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind him. Gabriel's body tensed as he turned, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing in the doorway of the warehouse was a shadow, tall and imposing. The figure stepped into the light, and Gabriel's breath caught. It was Dominic Wells, John's younger brother. Gabriel hadn't seen him in years, but there was no mistaking the dangerous gleam in his eyes. "I see you found my family's little secret," Dominic said, his voice low and menacing. Gabriel stood frozen, the weight of everything he had just discovered crashing down on him. The battle for Marcus and Noah's future had just begun. The tension in the warehouse was suffocating. Gabriel stood face to face with Dominic Wells, his body frozen as the realization of everything he had uncovered set in. The man before him, once just another name in the past, now stood as the embodiment of the danger Marcus and Noah had been running from. Gabriel's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and resolve fighting for dominance. Dominic's eyes gleamed with a cold intensity, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. His presence filled the room with an oppressive weight, one that made Gabriel's skin crawl. Dominic took a step forward, his voice low, each word dripping with contempt. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't," Dominic said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This isn't your fight, Gabriel." Gabriel's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively reaching for the phone in his pocket. But he knew that calling for help, calling for the police, wouldn't be enough. The stakes were too high now. This was no longer just about protecting the children. It was about surviving the storm Dominic had unleashed with his dangerous game. "I won't let you harm them," Gabriel said, his voice unwavering despite the turmoil inside. Dominic chuckled darkly, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. "Harm them? No, Gabriel. I'm offering you a chance, an opportunity to take the legacy you've always craved. All you have to do is accept it." Gabriel's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and everything he had assumed about his former business partner, John Wells, was wrong. Dominic wasn't just a shadow in the background, He was the mastermind, the one pulling the strings behind everything. He had been waiting for Gabriel to discover the truth, to come to him willingly like a moth to the flame. "And what's your game here, Dominic?" Gabriel asked, taking a cautious step back. His thoughts were moving faster than his body could keep up with. "You've been hiding behind these kids all along. Why?" Dominic's smile widened, but there was nothing warm in it. "It's simple, really. The children are the key. You have the money, the power, but you'll never truly have control until you realize that. Take the children in, protect them, and you'll gain everything you've ever wanted." Gabriel's mind flashed to Marcus and Noah, the innocent faces that had trusted him. He realized in that moment what Dominic had been playing at all along. He wanted Gabriel to become a pawn in his own twisted game of control. Gabriel had to make a choice. He could either back down, let Dominic have his way and continue his life as the successful but emotionally bankrupt businessman he'd been, or he could fight back. The tension in the room tightened, and Gabriel felt a surge of emotion that he had buried for years. Fear, anger, and something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something like love for these children who had unexpectedly become his responsibility. "I won't play your game, Dominic," Gabriel said, his voice firm. "You've lost already." Dominic's expression darkened, and before Gabriel could react, Dominic reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a phone. "You think you can just walk away from this, Gabriel? The game is only beginning." He turned away, making a call that Gabriel couldn't hear, his back to Gabriel as he spoke quickly and quietly into the phone. Gabriel's pulse raced. Something was coming. He didn't know what, but Dominic was preparing for something. Without warning, the warehouse doors slammed open. Gabriel's body tensed as three men entered, their steps heavy and deliberate. They were armed, dangerous men. Gabriel's mind raced as he weighed his options, fight or flee. He wasn't prepared to fight this battle, not physically, but there was another way. As the men advanced, Gabriel's instincts kicked in. Protecting the children came first. He knew he had to get Marcus and Noah to safety, no matter the cost. Before the men could reach him, Gabriel darted to the far side of the warehouse where he knew the emergency exit was. He glanced back at Dominic, who remained motionless as if watching a puppet show unfold. "Stay back!" Gabriel shouted, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. He made a split-second decision and bolted toward the exit. The children. They were the priority now. He had to make sure they were safe. He wouldn't allow Dominic to use them as pawns any longer. Gabriel could hear the heavy footsteps of the men closing in behind him, but he didn't dare look back. His mind was set. He could hear Marcus's voice in his head, that question that had haunted him all night. "You won't take him away?" Gabriel rushed through the door, the cold night air hitting him like a shock to his system. He didn't stop running until he reached his car where his bodyguard Mike was waiting. The engine roared to life as Gabriel climbed in. "Go," Gabriel said, his voice strained. "Get us out of here." Mike didn't ask questions. He floored the gas pedal and the car sped away from the warehouse. Gabriel's hands clenched into fists, his thoughts spinning. What had he just walked into? And how had he gotten so deep into this mess without even realizing it? As the car pulled away, Gabriel glanced out the window, looking back toward the warehouse. Dominic, his former partner, his old ally, was no longer just a shadow of the past. He was an enemy, a force that Gabriel would have to fight if he had any hope of protecting Marcus and Noah. Gabriel's phone buzzed. He didn't need to look at it to know it was a message from Eleanor. "They're safe for now, but you need to act quickly. Dominic won't stop until he gets what he wants." He gripped the phone tightly, his resolve hardening. It was clear now. Dominic wasn't just after control of his empire. He wanted something far more dangerous, and Gabriel wasn't going to let him take that from him. Not now. Not ever. As the car drove through the darkened streets, Gabriel's mind was set on one thing: finding out how deep Dominic's reach went, and destroying it before it destroyed everything Gabriel had worked for. The drive to his estate felt interminable. Gabriel's thoughts churned like a storm in his chest, each passing moment feeling heavier than the last. He stared out the window, watching the city blur past him, though nothing registered in his mind. He was numb, consumed by the weight of everything that had unfolded. The pieces of his past and present were colliding in ways he couldn't have predicted, and there was no escaping the truth now. Dominic Wells, his former business partner, his old ally, wasn't just someone who had vanished into the shadows. He had been the orchestrator of something far darker than Gabriel had ever imagined. The revelations from the warehouse had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just about control or power anymore. It was about family, Marcus and Noah's family, and the twisted legacy that tied them all together. The car pulled into the driveway of Gabriel's mansion, the headlights illuminating the grandeur of the place. The sprawling estate, once a symbol of Gabriel's success, now felt like a cage. He stepped out, his body tense, his mind racing with the brutal reality of his situation. He walked into the house, where Eleanor was waiting for him, her face pale with worry. "Are they okay?" Gabriel asked, his voice tight with concern. Eleanor nodded, though there was a lingering uncertainty in her eyes. "They're safe for now. But Gabriel, we can't keep them here much longer. Dominic, he's going to come after them." Gabriel's jaw clenched. He had no time to waste. Dominic wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted, and Gabriel wasn't about to let him tear apart the lives of innocent children to satisfy some sick thirst for control. He had to find out how far Dominic's influence spread, and how to stop him before it was too late. But there was more at play here than just Dominic. Gabriel could feel it, lurking in the background like a shadow. The past he had buried for so long, his decisions, his betrayals, his ambition, was coming back to haunt him. The weight of it all felt suffocating. As the hours passed, Gabriel's mind wandered back to the early days of his career. He'd been so focused on building his empire, on the deals, the contracts, the numbers, that he had pushed everything else aside. Friendship, loyalty, even love. In those early years, John Wells had been a trusted partner, someone who had shared his vision and ambition. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Gabriel couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when their paths had diverged, but he knew that the decision he made to sever ties with John was the moment that had set this all in motion. The regret was like a bitter taste in his mouth, one he couldn't get rid of. Gabriel walked through the mansion, the silence of the house pressing down on him. He had built this place with his own hands, brick by brick, climbing the ladder of success with no one to stop him. But as he walked through the darkened halls, he realized how empty it all felt. The wealth, the power, none of it mattered anymore. It had never mattered. The only thing that truly mattered now were Marcus and Noah, and he had to protect them from the consequences of his own actions. As Gabriel entered his study, the photo on his desk caught his eye. The picture of him and Dominic in the early days. They had looked so happy, so full of promise. But now, looking at it, Gabriel couldn't help but wonder if that was just a lie. Had Dominic ever truly been his friend? Or had he always been using Gabriel to further his own agenda? He reached for the phone, dialing the number of his lawyer. Gabriel needed answers. He needed to know what options he had to protect Marcus and Noah from the storm that was inevitably coming. The phone rang once, twice, and then his lawyer's voice came on the line. "Mr. Kingston, what can I do for you?" the lawyer asked, his voice smooth but cautious. "I need you to look into Dominic Wells," Gabriel said, his voice cold. "And John Wells. I need to know everything. Everything they've been involved in. All their connections. We're not just talking about a business deal here. This goes deeper than that." There was a pause on the other end, and then the lawyer spoke. "I'll start digging into it right away. But Gabriel, you have to understand, these are dangerous people you're dealing with. I suggest you take extra precautions. The Wells family is not what it appears." Gabriel's grip on the phone tightened. Dangerous. He knew that. He had felt it in the pit of his stomach the moment he saw Dominic in that warehouse. But he wasn't backing down. He couldn't. The stakes were too high now. Too much was at risk. "I know," Gabriel said quietly. "Just make sure you get me everything. We can't afford any mistakes." He hung up the phone, his mind racing. The walls of his mansion, once a symbol of everything he had worked for, now felt like they were closing in around him. The past, the decisions he had made, and the shadows of his own ambition were all crashing into his present. Gabriel felt the weight of it all, the betrayal, the guilt, the secrets, and there was no escaping it. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. As Gabriel sat in his study, the quiet of the house pressing down on him, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the man he had once been. The old Gabriel Kingston, the ruthless businessman, the man who had cut ties without a second thought, had been swallowed up by the gravity of his own choices. And in his place stood someone new, someone who was determined to protect Marcus and Noah, even if it meant risking everything he had built. The sound of footsteps outside his door pulled him from his thoughts. Gabriel stood, his mind sharp, his body tense. It was time to take action. There was no room for hesitation. As he opened the door, Eleanor stepped in, her expression grim. "They're asking about the children," she said, her voice low. "The police have been asking questions, Gabriel. They know something's going on." Gabriel's heart skipped a beat. The police, they had always been a last resort, a necessary evil in Gabriel's world. But now, with Dominic Wells pulling the strings, he wasn't sure who could be trusted. "We're not going to the police yet," Gabriel said firmly. "We handle this ourselves. We need to know exactly who is involved and how far the web stretches. Then we act." Eleanor nodded, but there was a trace of worry in her eyes. Gabriel understood. They were all caught in this web now, tangled in a game far darker than anything he had ever imagined. But Gabriel wasn't going to let that stop him. He was ready to face the weight of the past, to do whatever it took to keep Marcus and Noah safe, even if it meant walking into the fire. Gabriel couldn't sleep. The weight of everything that had transpired since Marcus and Noah's arrival was heavier than he had anticipated. Every inch of the mansion, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The walls felt suffocating, the silence deafening, and every ticking second felt like the countdown to an inevitable storm. Dominic Wells was playing a game, one that Gabriel had never intended to be part of, yet here he was, caught in a battle that had everything to do with the children's survival and nothing to do with the wealth and power that had once defined him. As the early morning light filtered through the curtains, Gabriel sat in the study, staring at the phone on his desk. The message from his lawyer still weighed heavily on his mind. Dominic's connections were deeper and more dangerous than he had imagined. Every step forward felt like a step into a trap. The children, his children now in a way, were the key to it all, and Dominic was prepared to do anything to reclaim them. But Gabriel was done running from the shadows. He was no longer the cold businessman who could calculate every move and make his decisions without consequence. He was someone else now, a man determined to protect the innocent, no matter the cost. He couldn't afford to ignore the fear in Marcus's eyes any longer, couldn't afford to let the boy feel abandoned again. As he rose from the desk, Gabriel's mind was clear. He would protect them. He had no other choice. And to do so, he had to be proactive, calculated, and ruthless in his own right. The next morning, after a tense breakfast, Gabriel sat with Eleanor in the living room discussing their options. The children were safe for now, but the situation was getting more dangerous by the hour. They had to stay ahead of Dominic, outsmart him at every turn. The first step was to find out more about John Wells, about Dominic's criminal activities, and about how far his influence reached. "We need to move them," Eleanor said, her voice low. "Staying here is too risky. If Dominic has already got his sights set on this house, we won't be able to protect them for long." Gabriel nodded. He knew she was right. The mansion, for all its security and isolation, couldn't shield them from the storm that was brewing. They needed to find somewhere off the grid, somewhere Dominic wouldn't think to look, somewhere that offered both protection and anonymity. "I'll make the arrangements," Gabriel said. "Get them packed. We leave tonight." Eleanor didn't question him. She simply nodded and went to prepare. Gabriel felt a pang of guilt. The children, especially Marcus, had been through enough already. They didn't deserve to be pulled around from one place to another, forced to leave the only semblance of safety they had found. But it was the only way to keep them alive. Gabriel turned his attention back to the papers scattered across his desk. The connections Dominic had built in his years of criminal dealings were no longer just rumors. They were real, tangible threats. Gabriel had already contacted his lawyer, But now he needed to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't just going to wait for Dominic to make the first move. Later that afternoon, Gabriel stood in the back of the mansion, gazing out at the sprawling grounds. The weight of the decision ahead settled on him with crushing force. He could hear the distant sound of Marcus and Noah's laughter echoing from the other side of the house. For a fleeting moment, Gabriel allowed himself to believe that this could be a simple life, one where he was a protector rather than a player in a dangerous game. But reality quickly set in. As he turned to leave, he was stopped by a sharp knock at the door. Eleanor entered quickly, her expression grim. "The police," she said quietly. "They're here. They've been asking questions about you, about the children." Gabriel's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had feared. Dominic's influence had already begun to stretch its tendrils into every part of his life, including the authorities. The game had shifted, and he was no longer in control. They were out of time. "We can't let them find out anything," Gabriel said, his voice steely. "Get them to the safe house, now." Eleanor nodded, and with that, Gabriel stepped into action. The children had to be moved immediately, but there was no time to prepare for a long journey. The safe house wasn't far, a secluded property nestled in the hills outside of the city. But getting them there undetected would be a challenge. As evening fell, Gabriel stood in the driveway watching as the last of the children's things were packed into the car. Marcus, still clinging to Noah, looked up at him, his eyes wide with fear. The questions were there, unspoken, lingering in the air. Gabriel didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let them down. "Are we going to be okay?" Marcus asked, his voice small but filled with an innocence Gabriel hadn't realized he was missing. Gabriel crouched down to Marcus's level, offering the boy the reassurance he so desperately needed. "You're safe with me," Gabriel said firmly. "I won't let anyone take you away." Marcus nodded, but the fear was still there, etched deep in his eyes. Gabriel wanted to believe that he could give Marcus everything he needed: stability, safety, love, but the reality of the situation was far more complicated. The storm was only beginning, and Gabriel wasn't sure how much longer he could protect them. As the car sped through the city, Gabriel's mind raced. The safe house was their only option, but Dominic wasn't far behind. He would have eyes everywhere. Gabriel's phone buzzed, a message from his lawyer. The information was there, but it came with a warning. "Watch your back. Dominic has eyes on you. Don't trust anyone." Gabriel's hand tightened around the phone. The fight had only just begun, and now it was more than just about protecting Marcus and Noah. It was about surviving and finding a way to dismantle the empire Dominic had built before it consumed them all. As the car pulled into the safe house, Gabriel knew that every choice he made from here on out would determine the fate of the children, his empire, and everything he had built. The drive to the safe house had been uneventful, but the tension in the air was palpable. Gabriel sat in the back of the car, his mind racing as the wheels turned over the winding roads, heading toward their temporary refuge. He glanced back at Marcus and Noah, who were quietly nestled under blankets in the back seat. Noah, still too young to understand the gravity of their situation, clung to Marcus, who, despite his protective nature, seemed lost in thought, the weight of everything they had endured heavy on his small shoulders. For a brief moment, Gabriel allowed himself to hope that the worst of it was over, that they would find peace in this secluded place, away from the chaos that had consumed their lives. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't a safe haven. It was only a temporary stop in a much larger fight, one that had already begun and would only grow more dangerous from here. As the car approached the gates of the safe house, Gabriel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for it, his stomach tightening as he saw the name on the screen. Eleanor. "Mr. Kingston," Eleanor's voice came through, shaky but controlled. "We've got a problem. Someone's been asking about you, about the children. They're getting closer." Gabriel's grip tightened on the phone, the blood draining from his face. He had known this moment would come. He had prepared for it, but hearing it now, knowing the threat was already looming over them, sent a chill through his spine. "Do you know who it is?" Gabriel asked, his voice calm despite the storm raging inside him. "They're not giving anything away," Eleanor replied, "but I think they've figured out where we are. We don't have much time. Gabriel's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting the gaze of the driver. The situation was rapidly escalating. They couldn't stay here any longer. Dominic's reach was far too wide, but there was one thing Gabriel had learned throughout his life. He couldn't keep running. The time to confront the truth, to stop Dominic once and for all, had arrived. The safe house loomed ahead, a large, imposing structure surrounded by thick woods and high fences. Gabriel's mind was already racing, strategizing their next move. He needed to keep Marcus and Noah safe at all costs, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. There was more at stake than just protecting them. The past, his mistakes, his ties to Dominic's empire, was closing in around him, threatening to tear apart everything he had fought for. As they entered the house, Gabriel's mind was elsewhere. Eleanor had taken the children to the back rooms, settling them in for the night. But Gabriel couldn't rest. He had to plan their next move. The weight of his decisions, the history that had led them all here, pressed down on him like an insurmountable mountain. He had severed ties with Dominic years ago, believing he was walking away from the darkness. But now it was clear there was no escaping it. The ties that had bound them in business had never truly been cut, and the consequences of those choices were playing out now in the most dangerous way possible. Gabriel paced the living room, his eyes scanning the walls, looking for something he could hold on to. He had been so focused on building his empire that he had forgotten to build relationships, to build something worth protecting beyond wealth and power. The legacy he had worked so hard to create now felt hollow, empty, because it had been built on shaky foundations. He had burned bridges, lost friends, and crushed anyone who got in his way. And now he had no one left to help him in the fight for these children's future. There was a knock at the door. Gabriel's heart skipped a beat as he walked toward it, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun in the drawer. He opened the door to find Eleanor, her face pale, her eyes filled with worry. "They're here," she said simply. Gabriel's heart sank. Dominic had found them. He had expected it, but that didn't make the reality any easier to face. They couldn't stay here another night. Gabriel's gaze fell on the children, who were now quietly sitting on the couch, unaware of the danger closing in around them. Marcus was gripping Noah tightly, his small body trembling. Gabriel knelt in front of them, his eyes softening as he met Marcus's gaze. "We're not safe here anymore, Marcus," he said gently. "But I promise you, I won't let anything happen to you. You and Noah are my responsibility now. Your family." Marcus looked up at Gabriel, his eyes full of doubt and fear. "Family?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "But you didn't have to do this. You didn't have to help us." Gabriel felt a wave of emotion rise in his chest. The words Marcus spoke were simple, but they struck at the core of everything Gabriel had come to understand about himself over the past few days. He wasn't the man he used to be. He had made his choices, and now the ties that had bound him to Dominic and to a life of ambition and greed were no longer his chains. "We're in this together," Gabriel said softly, reaching out to take Marcus's hand. "You're not alone anymore. I promise." The car ride to the next location was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on Gabriel like never before. He wasn't just running from Dominic anymore. He was confronting the truth of who he had become and what he needed to do to make it right. But the truth was complex. The past couldn't be erased, and the ties between him and Dominic ran deeper than he could ever have anticipated. The car pulled into a small, unmarked warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Gabriel took a deep breath as he turned to face Marcus and Noah. This would be their final stop. There was no going back. It was here that Gabriel would finally face the consequences of his past, and it was here that he would fight to ensure that the children's future would not be dictated by the sins of their father. As they got out of the car, Gabriel looked at the children once more. He saw the fear in their eyes, but also something else. A flicker of trust, a glimmer of hope. The ties that bound them were stronger than blood, stronger than anything Gabriel had ever known, and he would protect that bond, even if it meant losing everything else. They entered the warehouse, the shadows of the night swallowing them whole. Gabriel knew the danger was far from over, But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose that he had never felt before. The warehouse was dark, its dimly lit interior only illuminated by the faint glow of distant streetlights filtering through the dusty windows. Gabriel's footsteps echoed across the cold concrete floor, each one feeling heavier than the last. The air inside felt thick with tension, like a storm was about to break. He could hear Marcus and Noah behind him, their presence a constant reminder of what was at stake, their lives. Every decision from here on out would determine their future. It was no longer just about protecting them from Dominic. It was about facing the demons of his own past and taking responsibility for the choices he had made. The empire he had built, the betrayal of his old friend, the long-buried guilt. All of it had led him to this moment. Now there was only one thing left to do: confront Dominic. Gabriel's phone buzzed in his pocket and his heart skipped a beat as he pulled it out. It was a message from Eleanor. "They found us. Dominic's men are closing in. You don't have much time." His pulse quickened, but he couldn't show any fear. He couldn't let Marcus or Noah see it. They had already seen enough fear in their short lives. It was his job now to be their protector, their anchor. He typed a quick response, telling Eleanor to stay with the children and to get them out of harm's way. The warehouse wasn't safe, but they had no other choice. It was the only place where he could make a stand. Gabriel glanced back at Marcus, who was gripping Noah tightly, the fear in his eyes still visible but tempered by Gabriel's reassurance. For the first time in weeks, Gabriel felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, not as a businessman, but as a protector. He turned and faced the shadows at the far end of the warehouse. Dominic Wells was out there somewhere, pulling the strings from behind the veil. Gabriel had no doubt that his former business partner was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, the moment they had feared since the very beginning. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, and Gabriel's heart leaped into his throat. He turned to see Dominic step into the light, his cold eyes fixed on Gabriel. There was no surprise in Dominic's expression, only a certain dark satisfaction, as if he had known this moment would come all along. "Well, well," Dominic said, his voice low and menacing. "I see you've decided to play the hero. How quaint." His eyes flicked briefly to Marcus and Noah, and Gabriel felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. Dominic had never cared about the children. They were nothing more than pawns in his twisted game. But Gabriel would not let them be used any longer. "Stay away from them, Dominic," Gabriel said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Dominic and the children. "I don't want this to get any uglier than it already has." Dominic chuckled, a dark, humorless sound that echoed through the warehouse. "You think you can stop me? After all these years, you're still the same naive man you were when I first met you. You can't save them, Gabriel. You can't save anyone. You never could." Gabriel's jaw tightened. He had been wrong about Dominic once, but he wouldn't make that mistake again. "It's not about saving anyone anymore," Gabriel said. "It's about making things right." Dominic's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Making things right?" He shook his head. "You can't erase the past, Gabriel. You can't undo what's been done." "I don't need to undo it," Gabriel said, his voice unwavering. "I just need to stop you." Dominic's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of anger. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're making a huge mistake, Gabriel," he warned. "You don't understand what you're up against. I've built an empire that can't be taken down by someone like you." Gabriel took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Dominic's. "No, Dominic. You built an empire on fear and manipulation, but I'm done being afraid, and I'm done letting you control anyone else's fate." The air between them crackled with tension. Dominic was a dangerous man, but Gabriel had seen the truth of him now, the monster hiding behind the charm and wealth. He had no power over Gabriel anymore. The only thing that mattered now was protecting Marcus and Noah. Suddenly the sound of sirens broke through the tension, cutting through the stillness of the warehouse. Dominic's eyes darted to the door, his expression shifting from confidence to concern. Gabriel could feel the change in the air. The moment was here, the moment they had both been waiting for. But it wasn't going to end the way Dominic had planned. "We're out of time, Gabriel," Dominic said, his voice low, his eyes flickering with fury. "But mark my words, this isn't over. This is just the beginning." Gabriel didn't flinch. He knew what had to be done. The authorities were closing in. He had bought himself just enough time to make sure that Marcus and Noah were safe, that Dominic's hold on them was finally broken. And once it was, he would make sure that Dominic never had the chance to hurt anyone again. With a swift motion, Gabriel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, preparing to send one last message. It wasn't to Eleanor or his lawyer. It was to the only person who could bring Dominic down once and for all. The sirens grew louder, and Dominic's face twisted with fury as he realized what was happening. He turned to leave, his hand reaching for the door, but Gabriel's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Your time is up, Dominic," Gabriel said. "The police are already here, and you're going to answer for everything." Dominic paused for a moment, his back still turned to Gabriel, his shoulders tense. He didn't turn around, but Gabriel could see the bitterness in his posture. "I don't need the law to protect me," Dominic said, his voice bitter. "I built this empire on my terms. No one will stop me." "You're wrong," Gabriel said firmly. "The only thing that matters now is the future, and that's something you can't control." Dominic took one last long look at Gabriel before disappearing into the shadows. Gabriel stood still for a moment, waiting before turning to face Marcus and Noah. His heart was heavy, but there was a glimmer of something new, something hopeful. The sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer with every passing second. The authorities were on their way, and Gabriel had done what he could. The game had changed, and for the first time in years, he wasn't running from his past. He was finally confronting it. The sounds of sirens echoed in Gabriel's ears as he stood in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. Dominic had disappeared into the night, but Gabriel knew it was far from over. The battle wasn't won yet, not by a long shot. Gabriel turned to look at Marcus and Noah, their innocent faces still etched with the fear they had carried since the night they had met. They had been through so much, and Gabriel had promised to protect them. But as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, he felt the growing burden of that promise. Protection wasn't just about keeping them safe from harm. It was about shielding them from a world that seemed bent on tearing them apart. It was about standing between them and the forces that would destroy everything they had. And that was the hardest part, the emotional toll of knowing that no matter how much he did, there would always be another threat around the corner. Gabriel paced the room, running his hand through his hair. His thoughts were tangled in the aftermath of everything that had happened. Dominic's empire was vast, and Gabriel knew that he had only scratched the surface of the dangers they were facing. But he couldn't let that stop him. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. He glanced back at Marcus, who was sitting in the corner, cradling Noah in his arms. Despite everything they had been through, Marcus still looked to Gabriel for reassurance. It was a reminder of how much responsibility Gabriel had taken on, a responsibility he couldn't ignore. Eleanor entered the room, her expression filled with concern. "The police are on their way. I told them about Dominic's men, and they're moving fast." Gabriel nodded, his gaze distant. The authorities were finally getting involved, but Gabriel knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were too many unanswered questions, and Dominic was still out there watching, waiting for his next move. "We can't stay here long," Eleanor continued, her voice tight with worry. "We need to move the kids again, just to be safe." Gabriel nodded once more, his eyes focusing on Marcus and Noah. They had been through so much already. The least he could do now was give them the sense of safety they desperately needed. But the truth was, Gabriel knew that safety was an illusion. As long as Dominic was out there, they would never truly be safe. But he couldn't let that stop him. He couldn't let the fear rule him. As Gabriel turned toward the door, he felt the familiar knot of uncertainty settle in his stomach. The weight of the decisions he had made, the responsibility of protecting them, was overwhelming. He wasn't just protecting Marcus and Noah from Dominic's wrath. He was protecting them from a world that didn't care about them, a world that would chew them up and spit them out if they weren't careful. Gabriel had been a ruthless businessman, but now he was something else, a father, a protector, and this role was harder than anything he had ever done before. His past had been built on cold, calculated decisions, but now there was a vulnerability he couldn't ignore. Every moment spent with Marcus and Noah brought out a tenderness he hadn't known he was capable of. It was a softness that both terrified and exhilarated him. As they prepared to leave, Gabriel couldn't help but wonder how long he could keep this up. How long before the burden of protection became too much for him to bear. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't sure he ever could be. But for Marcus and Noah, he would keep fighting. The sound of the front door opening broke his thoughts. It was time to move. The police were close, and they had to be ready to leave before Dominic's men got to them first. Gabriel knew that if they didn't act quickly, everything they had done would be for nothing. He walked to the front door, Eleanor close behind him, and looked back at the children. He felt the weight of the responsibility press down on him again, but this time it wasn't as overwhelming as before. The fear was still there, but there was something else: determination. They stepped out into the cold night air, the weight of their choices now clearer than ever. Gabriel knew that the journey ahead would be full of more struggles, more challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a reason to fight. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, but he pushed forward, determined to protect them. There would be no turning back. Dominic was still out there, and he was coming for them. But Gabriel would be ready. He wouldn't let anything happen to the children he had promised to protect. As they drove away, Gabriel's thoughts were heavy with the uncertainty of what was to come. But no matter what, he would face it head on. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about them, Marcus, Noah, and a future he would fight to secure, no matter the cost. The dawn broke quietly over the horizon as Gabriel sat in the quiet sanctuary of the small cabin they had retreated to. The children were still asleep, their small breaths filling the room with a sense of calm that Gabriel hadn't felt in weeks. The past few days had been a whirlwind, a blur of moving from place to place, always a step ahead of the danger that seemed to lurk around every corner. But here, in this secluded spot far away from the chaos, there was a fleeting sense of peace. Gabriel stared out the window, his thoughts drifting back to the night they had left the warehouse. Dominic had disappeared, but Gabriel knew better than to think it was over. Dominic's reach was vast, and Gabriel's mind was constantly working, always on guard. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at normalcy. The heavy weight of the past, the betrayals, the lies, the cold, calculated decisions was still there, gnawing at him. But something was different now. The children, Marcus and Noah, had changed him. He had promised to protect them, and he intended to keep that promise. No more running, no more looking back. This was their new beginning, a fresh start away from the shadows of his old life. As the sun rose higher, Gabriel moved to the small kitchen, where Eleanor was already preparing breakfast. The warmth of the cabin felt comforting, the simplicity of the moment almost too good to be true. He had built this life on wealth, on ambition, on the pursuit of power. But now, standing in the glow of the morning light, he realized that all of that had meant nothing if he couldn't protect the ones who mattered most. Eleanor looked up as he entered, offering him a tired but warm smile. "They're still sleeping," she said, nodding toward the bedroom where Marcus and Noah were tucked into the bed. "They need this rest, Gabriel. You need it too." Gabriel sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He hadn't slept much in the past few days, the anxiety of their situation keeping him on edge. But Eleanor was right. They needed this time to regroup, to find some semblance of normal. He could feel the emotional exhaustion starting to weigh him down, but he couldn't afford to let up. Not yet. "They deserve a chance to feel safe," Gabriel said, his voice heavy with the weight of his responsibility. "I don't know how long we can keep moving like this, but for now, we need to focus on their future." Eleanor set the plate of food down in front of him. "We'll get there," she said, her voice firm. "You've already done more than anyone could have expected." Gabriel met her eyes, his gaze softening for a moment. He appreciated her support, but it wasn't enough. Dominic was still out there, still a threat to everything Gabriel had come to care about. And now that he had made his choice to protect Marcus and Noah, there was no turning back. "You know he won't stop, right?" Gabriel said, his voice laced with determination. "Dominic will come after us again. He'll come after them, and we won't be ready unless we know how far he'll go." Eleanor nodded. "We'll stay ahead of him," she said, more to reassure Gabriel than herself. "We'll keep moving. We've done it before." As Gabriel ate, his mind worked through their options. He had always been able to plan, to calculate the next steps in any business deal, any corporate maneuver. But this was different. This was about survival, not just profit. He couldn't rely on the same tactics that had brought him success in his career. He had to think about the bigger picture now, Marcus and Noah's future. His thoughts turned to the day they had left the mansion, when Dominic's men had been closing in. It had been a moment of raw decision, a moment when Gabriel realized just how much had changed within him. He had promised himself that he would never let his past define him, and now, with everything on the line, he had to live up to that promise. For the first time in his life, he wasn't acting out of ambition. He wasn't doing this for the wealth, for the power, or even for revenge. He was doing this because he had learned the hard way that protecting those you love, protecting innocence, was the only thing that truly mattered. Later that morning, Gabriel sat with Marcus in the small living room, the boy's wide eyes filled with curiosity. Marcus had come a long way since that night on the streets, but the fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface. Gabriel could see it in the way Marcus clung to Noah, in the way he hesitated when Gabriel reached out to him. "Hey," Gabriel said gently, meeting Marcus's gaze, "I know this is all a lot to take in, but I want you to know something. No matter what happens, you're safe here. You and Noah, you'll always be safe." Marcus nodded, but Gabriel could tell the boy wasn't entirely convinced. Safety was a fragile thing, especially for someone who had been forced to grow up too fast. Gabriel could feel his heart tighten as he watched Marcus protectively tuck Noah closer to him. "I'm not going anywhere, okay?" Gabriel said, his voice firm but tender. "I'm here, and I'm not leaving you, both of you." Marcus finally looked up at him, his eyes still wary but filled with a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Gabriel reached out, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You're not alone in this," Gabriel added. "We'll figure this out together." The day passed quietly, but Gabriel knew that peace wouldn't last. The burden of protection weighed heavily on him. Every decision, every move they made, had the potential to change everything. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, and he couldn't afford to fail them. As the evening drew near, Gabriel stepped outside for a moment of solitude. The cool evening air felt like a much-needed breath of fresh air, though his thoughts remained clouded with worry. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt as though he had something worth fighting for. And that was a new beginning, a new purpose. Dominic's reach was far, but Gabriel had learned that family, true family, was a force that no empire could control. The past was behind him now. The future was all that mattered, and he would protect them with everything he had.